So as Stuart said, I am a University of Florida IFAS Extension agent with Florida Sea Grant, and I work in Pinellas County. However, with this work, I do work regionally throughout the Tampa Bay region. So I'm going to provide just a little bit of a snapshot where Tampa Bay is and what some of our issues are, and then go into some of our sea level rise planning, the development of our recommendation for sea level rise projections, and how those projections are being utilized today by local governments and other agencies. So there you can see the map of Florida, and Tampa Bay is located in west central Florida on the Gulf of Mexico. We are a metropolitan area. Pinellas County is the most densely populated county in Florida. Hillsborough is quite dense as well, but then Hillsborough, Pasco, and Manatee also do have agriculture land as you go inland. We have about 700 miles of coast, over 3 million residents, and $170 billion regional economy. And a recent study by the Regional Planning Council showed that the bay itself, the waters of Tampa Bay, influence a little less than 1/3 of that economy. So that's either directly water dependent industries or also just the fact that businesses chose to locate in this region because of the value of Tampa Bay. And we have a diverse variety of cultural and natural resources that make the bay very unique in terms of the mangrove communities, the seagrass beds, the estuaries. They also make it economically important to fisheries, shipping, and other industry. So what are we seeing? We are seeing that we already have evidence of sea level rise in Tampa Bay. We have a tide station at the University of South Florida College of Marine Science in downtown St. Petersburg. It's been measuring sea levels since the 1920s, and the data is available online since 1946. From 1946 until today, we see 6.5 inches of sea level rise, or about 1 inch per decade. We also have a tide station up at Clearwater, which has been measuring for a shorter amount of time, but shows consistent data that correlates with what we see at the St. Petersburg tide gauge. This does tie in very closely with what we're seeing globally. So we don't have a lot of subsidence or uplift in our area. We are close to the global averages that are being seen today. So as I mentioned, we're densely populated. We're a very low-lying area, and a lot of our industry and residence is concentrated on the coast. So that makes us very vulnerable, and we're not the only ones to notice that. We've been called out in several national and international studies for our vulnerability. This World Bank study in 2013 cited the Tampa-St. Petersburg area as number 7 of the 10 most vulnerable coastal metropolitan areas globally. And that is based on the cost of doing nothing. That's just based on the assets that we have in the coastal areas as they are today. And as you'll hear throughout this talk, hopefully you'll agree at the end that we are planning to do something and decrease our vulnerability and increase our resilience. So most of you are probably familiar with these potential impacts of sea level rise, but they could affect the natural and built environment. Flooding we see at storms during tropical storms, also during heavy rains. If they're coupled with high tides, we see flooding in our region, and that's in part due to the coastal drainage systems that were built on gravity to help the water drain from the coastal areas, and with sea levels being higher these days, they are not always able to drain. What you see in this picture is a couple blocks from the bay, and that was during Tropical Storm Debbie in 2012. And so that was a combination there of the water not, salt water coming up through the stormwater drains, and also water not being able to drain off. We also do have a concern. We have 9 beach communities in Pinellas County and more up in Pasco and Manatee counties. And those beaches are already going through processes of artificial beach renourishment to keep the beaches staying as they are just because of erosion from average waves. So if we see increased wave height or increased amount of storms, we're going to see more erosion. And so that's, of course, an effect on the natural resources there, but also the infrastructure that is built on the beaches and being protected by the dune and the coastal systems. As I mentioned, we have the mangrove communities, the salt marsh, the salt terns, the seagrass beds, and hard bottom habitats. If we start to see sea level rise, we're going to see shifts in those habitats. And I'll mention at the end a study that's looking very closely at that in our region. So how did all this get started? The impetus of the work I'm going to talk about really began in 2014. The Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council is a great player in our region. At this time, they had 4 county governments under them: Pasco, Pinellas, Hillsborough, and Manatee. Since then, Hernando and Citrus, I believe, have joined us as well. But they sought out funding from a NOAA CREST grant with the support of some of our larger cities and academic institutions to become the convener for the region, for the planning community, to develop practical strategies for the area to withstand the effects of sea level rise and other hazards. Fortunately, they were granted that award, which was a 2-year award. And so they began to convene the planning community under their previous umbrella, which was called the One Bay. And they developed that into the One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group. So basically that's become a venue for sharing best practices on what folks are doing in the region to plan for, model, develop ordinances to plan for sea level rise. And at the same time, I have been facilitating the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel, or CSAP. And so the CSAP's main goal is to collaboratively develop scientific-based recommendations for local governments and regional agencies as they respond to climate change and associated sea level rise. So our membership was an invited membership based on local, regional, state, and federal scientists. We have representatives of scientists from the 4 county governments in the region. We have folks from the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, Tampa Bay Water, Tampa Bay Estuary Program, the National Weather Service, NOAA, U.S. Geological Survey. So I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but that's a good variety of the folks. And then we're also engaging the academic institutions. Excuse me. We have the University of South Florida College of Marine Science that has played a key leading role in this work. So as you can see, this is a collaborative approach. All our work really falls into, a lot of Venn diagrams where we cross over with one another. So the Climate Science Advisory Panel has made recommendations at just about every One Bay meeting. And in terms, we've taken feedback back to our group on the recommendations and tweaked the recommendations, as well as gotten comments on the communications message. So we think that what we're recommending is important, but how we say it and how we recommend it is also very important. We want a clear communication message. And also at the same time, there is other work that I engage in with other partners to engage the general public, I would say, in climate change conversations. We've done a public survey on perceptions of what folks are concerned about on climate change in our region. We've done the climate conversation programs where we look at potential futures in our region in terms of sea level rise, transportation and infrastructure, natural resources, sea level rise, water and food systems. And so that's continuing projects. And then I also have a marine research speaker series, which several of those talks each semester focus on sea level rise and climate change. So the Climate Science Advisory Panel's first working objective that we came to in 2014 was to formulate a recommendation for sea level rise projections to utilize for planning purposes in the Tampa Bay region. So as you know, in adaptation planning, one of the first steps is really awareness and acknowledgement of the issue. But the second step is to determine what the stressor is that you're going to be planning for. And as we know, there's not just one answer out there in terms of sea level rise projections. We have ones through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, through the National Climate Assessment, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Many universities have developed their own. So we went through a year-long process of reviewing the literature, inviting expert speakers, and having facilitated discussion. And after that year, we came up with the recommended projection of sea level rise in the Tampa Bay region. And as mentioned, as the Sea Grant agent, I served as the facilitator, have training, through the Florida Natural Resource Leadership Institute, also through the Gulf of Mexico Climate Outreach Community of Practice, Association of Natural Resource Extension Professionals. So really just been privileged to be a part of all these different training groups to learn how to facilitate complex conversations such as this. And as I'd say, it was very interesting to see what I learned get put into action. And I learned that things like the groan zone do exist. And there was one day where, it seems like everything's out on the table and you're not going to come up with a consensus. And then at the end of that day, we had our consensus and our recommendation, and it was kind of textbook facilitation. It was beautiful. So the highlights of our recommendation is we went with the projections that are used to inform the National Climate Assessment. A lot of people refer to those as the NOAA projections, but really they are a larger multi-agency effort. We chose those because we think they're very based in sound science. They do go through updating every 4 or 5 years along with the National Climate Assessment. And so we decided that we would revisit ours, not necessarily change them, but look at all the new available science every 4 or 5 years and decide if that is the time to update them. The benefit of using those curves as well is that if you could use the online Army Corps of Engineers tool and choose the NOAA projections, and you can regionally correct those projections using a local tide gauge. And so we had our St. Petersburg tide gauge, and we're able to get regionally corrected projections. Of course, as you'll see in a minute, that does still give you 4 lines of potential future sea level rise. So it's important that our planners know that, our planners, our engineers, our developers, the work is not done for them at this point. They need to decide which curves to plan for by looking at a scenario-based approach that considers location, time horizon, and risk tolerance. So just to show you, this is what our graph does look like. We've got the NOAA low, NOAA intermediate low, NOAA intermediate high, and the NOAA high. And these were the ones developed for the 2014 National Climate Assessment. And so as you know, it is undergoing revision right now. The NOAA low is based on historic sea level rise projections and does not account any future acceleration. The NOAA intermediate low takes a lot of the kind of the best available science based on thermal expansion of sea level rise and incorporates that together. The NOAA intermediate high incorporates more of the projections of ice melt along with the thermal expansion. And then, as we know, the NOAA high looks at what the highest levels of ice melt were predicted to be at the time, or forecast that they could be. As we look at this in graph form, this is another output from the Army Corps of Engineers tool. And you could choose your time increments. We chose 15 years, as you can see here. You can go smaller, up to 5 years, but I don't recommend that. I think that confuses the communication message, and then folks will tend to focus on those small increments of time. They tend to want to know which line are we on right now. And so we chose 15 years for that reason. You can see another slightly confusing part here is that The year does start at 1992, and that is because that is the current title datum being used for development, and that's based on an average over a time period, and that's the middle of that time period. So that is where it starts. So in our region, we're looking at 2050 about 1 to 1.5 feet of sea level rise, and by 2100 about 2 to 4 feet. Another communication piece that we feel is important to emphasize when working with our constituents is that sea level rise is not expected to end in 2100. That's something that has come up that, since the communications, the science community has been talking about 2100 for so long, it's created kind of a perception that things might end at that point. So a little bit about the scenario-based planning that we emphasize. You could kind of compare your garden shed in your backyard to your nuclear power plant. Of course, your garden shed, you're gonna, be happy if it's around for 20 years or so. You may or may not live on the water, so it might have, a high risk or low risk from getting impacted. But you're probably just storing, maybe a little bit of gasoline in there, nothing too overly toxic, and that's it. So, and it's a low cost investment. So you're probably not going to put that up 4 foot above base flood elevation if you don't have to, or 4 foot in your backyard. But then if you look at your nuclear power plant, of course, those tend to be built on the water, very close to sea level rise. You're probably hoping that they're going to last 50 to 100 plus years. And if things go bad with a nuclear power plant, the risk is very high for things going bad for your whole community. So I'll mention a little bit later how some of our local governments and agencies are starting to think about, how to kind of choose which scenario to plan for. So I'm going to get into some of the regional applications of the recommendation. So that recommendation was published in August 2015. We are an ad hoc group, the Climate Science Advisory Panel. We were given the blessing of the Pinellas County Board of County Commissioners to go ahead with our planning, but there was no official ratification or formation of the group, or it's different in that way from what happened in Southeast Florida, where the Board of County Commissioners all got together and signed onto a compact agreement. So our ad hoc group published the recommendation. We submitted it to the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council's One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group. They accepted the recommendation and presented it to the council with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and they agreed that it was a good document that should be distributed to local governments for planning purposes. So one group is the Tampa Bay Estuary Program that we have in the region. They do have the Climate Ready Estuary designation. They're doing a variety of projects to look at how sea level rise and climate change will affect the habitats and wildlife in the Tampa Bay region. So with their new study, the Tampa Bay Blue Carbon Project, they did utilize these projections in their analysis of what will happen to the mangroves, to the seagrass, as we look to the future with these sea level scenarios. They also have a variety of quadrats that go, transects that go from shore, from the water all the way inshore, and are looking at, well, that's a very long-term study where they're going to look at habitat shifts. So what they're finding with the study so far, the study does show that potentially the mangroves will be the losers in sea level rise, whereas the seagrass communities might be able to migrate, keep up with the sea level rise elevation. I think it definitely warrants a lot more research as they understand. I think the mangrove propagules have an ability to settle new areas, but the question is what's probably going to happen with the large established mangroves. Are they going to get drowned out and so on? But that's a lot of ongoing research they're doing, and just to show that the curves have an application there. The city of Tampa has conducted a sea level rise vulnerability assessment. So in Florida, we had a state bill, the Senate Bill 1094, the Peril of Flood Act, and it does, in the state bill, require communities to incorporate sea level rise vulnerabilities into their comprehensive plan in order to qualify for state funding for resilience planning. So that is why the city of Tampa took on this vulnerability assessment. They chose to look at the time span of their comprehensive plan, and so I believe they were focusing on the year 2040. And I think they chose the intermediate high projections as those that they looked at specifically. And Sean College was in charge of that. He presented that for me recently at the Florida Floodplain Managers Association conference as well. And these are all reports that are available online that I can get you in touch with if you want further details on them. Pinellas County currently has a request for a proposal out for a large-scale vulnerability assessment of their critical infrastructure. And they are doing this with money from the BP Restore Act. The City of St. Pete is kind of an add-on to that proposal. So if someone wanted to put in a proposal for both Pinellas County and the City of St. Pete, they could do so, and the City of St. Pete will be funding that themselves, that portion. Kelly Levy is over our Natural Resources Department, and she's also developing an online GIS tool to look at the vulnerability of the infrastructure and of capital improvement projects, and think about how that money should be spent in the future. We have various bridges, 3 major bridges that are due within the next not so distant future to be reconstructed or at least fortified. So they are considering sea level rise for those bridges as well. Tampa Bay looked at the national study Risky Business, the cost of doing nothing, and developed a local study. So they utilized these sea level rise projections to look mostly at property data maps and feed that into an economic model that they have developed in the past called the REMI model. And that just kind of outputs, and it's a very basic study that gives the economic impact of doing nothing to plan for sea level rise. So it's not a very dynamic model. It doesn't, it's a bathtub model for sea level rise, and it looks mostly at the building infrastructure. I don't think it incorporated much in terms of the roads and road access and so on. So it's just meant to be an introductory study, a conversation piece to talk about planning and where we might want to go. So through this process, we have learned a lot. We learned from other regions before we even started. So that's the don't reinvent the wheel. We looked to Southeast Florida, and from them, we did learn that various cities and counties in Southeast Florida were already planning on their own before they came together. So that was a little bit of a struggle for them, I might say, that they had to then kind of find ways to meet in the middle if they were committed to certain sea level rise projections or so on. And they did so, but it took a while. They also let us know that they didn't have the cities involved as early in the conversation as they might have looking back in hindsight. And so we tried to incorporate, our entire region, counties and cities as well through the One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group. I think making use of existing networks is very important, and this goes kind of into the trust building in the community. Is most communities already have networks that exist, like the Regional Planning Council's One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group. You have networks where people get together. People don't necessarily have a lot of time to start going to new meetings. I also think it's important that people realize that planning for sea level rise and climate change is an integral part of all of planning. And so if we always talk about it as a separate piece, then folks find it difficult to take ownership of it. Whereas if it, we try and talk about it as part of public works and development and planning and engineering and infrastructure and stormwater, then they might begin to take a little bit more ownership. Utilizing local scientists, research, and extension specialists is important. We're very lucky here in the Tampa Bay region. We're the largest hub of marine scientists in the Southeast United States. We have Dr. Gary Mitchum, who's been studying sea level rise for his whole career. Don Chambers was one of the co-authors on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Hillary Stockton with the USGS, I believe, is now on working with the National Climate Assessment. But in any ways that you could utilize local scientists and researchers, I think it's much easier to build the trust in the community than bringing in someone from the outside, whether or not the message is the same or different. And of course, taking the time to build the trust. Sometimes we feel like we know where we're trying to go and it shouldn't be that hard to get there, but it's very important to bring everyone along with you. So throughout our process, our climate science advisory panel probably had about 15 members with about 8 designated alternates, and not everyone could attend every meeting, and people get busy at different times. So when it came to reviewing and publishing the final documents, we kind of had some stops and starts of waiting for everyone to get up to speed and to understand the recommendation and to be sure that they were behind the recommendation. But that was a very important part of the process. You don't want to move forward with someone's name on a document that they're not entirely familiar with or that they don't feel ownership of. Transparency was very important. We do have all of our information available online, our reports from each meeting. The One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group set up a great website where they share every presentation that's ever occurred at their meetings, online tools, and so on. The fact that the CSAP went to just about every quarterly One Bay meeting and presented where we were at and got feedback, we think was very important with the transparency. And working regionally was important. I'm very glad that our Pinellas County Board of County Commissioners recognized the importance of working regionally. When it was brought to them, Pinellas County could have stood alone and tried to work on sea level rise planning, but when you share an entire body of water like Tampa Bay, it just makes better sense to work regionally. We're in the same watershed, we're around the same bay. And utilizing the best available science and having a framework available for update. So we know that there's a plethora of information out there for climate change and sea level rise. So making sure to use the trusted sources, being aware of the new literature as it comes out, but also being aware of what really is, a new report versus a new large keystone report that needs to be considered. And I believe that is all I have for that. So if you
Yeah, why don't you call up a website to show us while I give people instructions on the questions, if that makes sense. So yeah. If you have questions, folks, what you can do is you can try to connect to the audio and chime in that way. Sometimes people struggle because WebEx is complicated. And so you can also just type it into the chat area, or if you'd like the Q&A area, either or, and I can ask them for you. So let's, so whichever of those works for you works for me, assuming that I can successfully also unmute the attendees.
Okay, so can you hear me when I talk now, Stuart?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the Climate Science Advisory Panel, I've kept that information all on my University of Florida IFAS Extension webpage, and we do have all of our past meeting reports and our recommendation. So I can show you the recommendation. It is a 12-page document, but that's with appendices. We've really tried to make it very, very readable, limit limit the science, overly scientific talk as much as possible, and make it very, very plain language. So you can see we included the graphs and the recommendations, and then the summary, the key findings, which is what I presented in the slideshow. And then we have our references and our membership and acronyms and definitions at the end. And the One Bay Resilient Communities Working Group, so they've got their cost of doing nothing report, they've got the recommendation, the working group list, and the Livable Communities Working Group. And then you could go into the different meetings and click on all of the presentations that have been given in the past. So try and keep everything transparent, really limit, keep it clear who questions should go to for every organization, but also kind of limiting ownership. It's all about, moving the region forward as a unit together. And we have a lot of small municipalities as well as larger municipalities. So the Regional Planning Council is really key in helping the smaller communities increase their capacity. Okay.
Great. And we do have a question from Zach Rosen. And Zach asks, he says, you mentioned that there were surveys and climate conversations. Were these done in the communities surrounding Tampa Bay? And if so, how were these events conducted and what was the response or relationship with the community members?
Yeah, they were done in the, sorry, could you read the whole question again, Stuart?
And Zach, I've unmuted you if you want to talk, if you have that capability on your computer. But he says, you mentioned that there were surveys and climate conversations done. Did you do those in the communities around Tampa Bay? And how did you do it? And what was the response from the community members? And, how did you find them, I guess? And what did they think? What did they say? That kind of, a little more detail on that.
Yeah. So the surveys, we ended up with about 700 surveys, and we did those. It was a 5-question survey. We looked at Oregon's Sea Grant survey that they did years back and utilized some of those questions, kind of like, do you think the climate in your area is changing? How concerned are you about climate change in your region? How do you think climate change will affect you personally? Where do you get your information on climate change? And we gave those surveys at 3 different farmers markets, I believe, and then also at a science festival and at a film festival that was giving a sea level rise talk. So we do understand we had probably a skewed audience there. Folks that are going to attend those events are pretty kind of scientifically minded in general. But the overall response was that 89% of folks thought that the climate in our area was in fact changing. The climate conversation programs, we've done 5 of those throughout the Tampa Bay region. And we work in partnership with University of South Florida's one of the professors of anthropology. And so she was part of an NSF-funded grant to conduct interviews, and she developed kind of video scenarios based on future climate scenarios in Tampa Bay that were really meant to be, as I said, conversation pieces. So in general, folks, were very engaged. Those were set up to be mostly listening sessions. So they went around the different stations, as I said, with agriculture, water, natural resources, sea level rise, infrastructure, and talked about their concerns and what, in some cases, they thought the government should be doing to respond. We've now transitioned that into utilizing the National Issues Forum platform that they have, Climate Connections, I think it's called. I might be getting the second part of that wrong. But we've done a pilot study utilizing that in the Tampa Bay region. Let me see, I had a call on that this morning, so I have stuff right here. And we're going to be going across the east coast of Florida, Climate Choices. And we're doing that in a couple of weeks in the east coast of Florida and then continuing that here. And so the National Issues Forum, they set it up into 3 listening sessions based on different options. So option 1 is looking at sharply reducing emissions. Option 2 is preparing and protecting, so kind of more adaptation. And option 3 is accelerating innovation. And so we talked about, during those, we talked about examples of what could be done and trade-offs to consider. And so those are all really about, yeah, just getting feedback from folks on what their concerns are. And so far, those programs have just been advertised to the public, and they've attended based on their interest. So we still haven't, taken them to an and especially with the National Issues Forum, actually, it's beneficial to have folks in the room who do think climate change is happening and want to talk about what to do about it. If you had folks in the room that don't think it's happening at all, that would kind of be a non-starter for the conversation for that program.
Excellent, thank you. And again, if you have a question, just ping me in the chat or the Q&A, and I can either unmute you or we can I can ask your questions. And while we're waiting to see if anybody else does, I have a question about the communication piece. When you're trying to communicate with stakeholders about sea level rise, because you mentioned it, there's some points of potential confusion about using the different dates or why it goes back and how hard it is. Do you have any sort of general advice for, sea level rise specifically, what worked with stakeholders or what didn't? Because that's something that I'm going to be working on a lot in the next couple of years. And I'm always looking for sort of good strategies or what has worked.
Yeah, I mean, I always look back to the Columbia Research Center's report on the psychology of climate change communication, and they have, I think it's 8 or 10 points, and one is you get the audience's attention, but being aware of the overuse of emotional appeals. And so really generally we try and stick to the facts. I think the fact that we have historic data, I think that part of the conversation is good. Being able to show a photo of a local tide gauge and say, this professor, that's a member of your community has been collecting this data for these years, and that's it's just really solid, grounded, recordable data points that have been collected. And I think one of the reasons we started with sea level rise in our region is because we really did see it as the low-hanging fruit in terms of the science that was available, and in terms of, since the science is so solid and the measurements and the projections the science is quite solid around those, it's almost indisputable with sea level rise. Whereas, when we try and get into the future conversations about temperature and precipitation and public health, I feel like we have a lot more question marks, and so that's going to be a little more, and things can get, a little more controversial. But I would say, sticking with the facts, having consistent talking points that folks within your groups kind of are aware of. One thing I didn't have on here, is our kind of the final slide that I like to include, that my colleague Maya came up with. That is, the problem, our summary points are the problem is not insurmountable. We do have time to plan, and with proper planning, we could be more resilient as a result of our planning and protect our economy and our society and our infrastructure. So, yeah, I would say I think it's, some of these projections are showing, the extreme projections are showing very large numbers, and I'd warn folks about, starting. I think the conversation needs to start maybe on a shorter time frame, and on I don't know what I'd say, but like not the outlier curves, but more, kind of the central curves and what we might expect, and not using scare tactics. I think it's very important not to use scare tactics because you lose people too quickly.
Excellent, thanks. And I do want to say to everybody that we will send out sort of some basic info about this webinar, links to the websites and things like that, assuming that I have successfully recorded it, which I feel like I have, but you never know. We'll make the recording available along with a summary. So we will be in touch with more information. It usually takes a few weeks for me to turn that around. If you need something more immediate as far as like the websites and the resources, we can get you that too. And with that, I think there are no more questions. If you have a question, this is your last chance. And if not, go and enjoy your lunch if you haven't already eaten. We want to thank Libby Carnahan for this wonderful presentation. Great work that she's doing in Pinellas County. And thank you for attending. Our next webinar in the series will be probably next month. I'm trying to shore up the exact date and topic, but I'll email you with those details once they're available. We have a few cool webinars coming up. It's just trying to figure out which one we're going to do when. So stay tuned to your email inbox. Watch it with bated breath. Just stare at it and wait for my email to come, and it will eventually. And thank you to everybody. Oh, wait, hold on. It looks like Charles Thompson might have a question sneaking in at the last minute. Oh, his question is, thank you, Libby. I agree. Thank you, Libby. Yeah, everybody else have a great day, and thank you for attending. We'll be in touch.